Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Swiss IRM Group meeting on risk appetite and risk bearing. A topic that you hear quite often, and some people might say, okay, it's not even worth to address it, but that it might be worth to address it, and the opinions that our panelists have today and are going to share with us might change the minds. My name is Pascal Busch. I'm the chairman of the Switzerland chapter. And with us today, we have Rose Mora, member of the board of the Switzerland chapter, and David Lanois from Chapelle Consulting, plus Stéphane Martin, who is going to moderate this session today. From a facilities perspective, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A or the chat section of the webinar, so that we can then address these questions to the panelists. And with this, I hand over to Stéphane and hope you enjoy the session.
Thanks, Pascal. Good afternoon to all. So as we said, we have a very interesting topic today, and I will introduce the speakers, and I have a few challenging questions to ask them if the audience doesn't have any, but I'm sure that we will be quite motivated by the topic today. So we will begin with David Lanois. So he's an Associate Director, Risk Training and Practice at Chapelle Consulting, and I'll give you a very brief view about him. He has gained vast experience in risk management over the last 20 years, and worked in a wide range of sectors such as public services, finance, telecommunication, and life sciences. David's key achievement is bringing enterprise risk management and internal control to a higher level of maturity in international organizations. In addition, David is a regular guest lecturer at the HEC Lausanne and Solvay Brussels School, between others. David's creativity and ability to communicate complex matters makes him a highly well-regarded speaker and trainer for a wide range of audiences. And we'll see about this, right, David? So I'd like to hand over to David. He's going to share his screen, share his presentation, and we will maybe interrupt him for challenging questions. David, it's on you.
Perfect. Voila. So I guess now you all see my screen. I just need one yes.
Good, it's a yes.
Yes, fantastic. So I'm very glad to be here this afternoon to discuss about this risk appetite and tolerance limit that is a big topic. And I was quite shocked by your introduction, saying that people are maybe not considering well enough this topic, because I think it's really the cornerstone of doing risk management. Let's go through the traditional definition. I'm sorry, that's maybe my academical background, but I like to start with definition, and I have the causal one defining the risk appetite as the degree of risk on a broad-based level that a company or other entity is willing to accept in the pursuit of its goals. Yes, it has a big impact on the way any organization will operate. So defining this risk appetite will have a massive consequences on how things will be organized. But that's too easy. And I think, and what I would like, in fact, it's to push you to think beyond this tolerance for losses. In fact, when we go and when we discuss with our colleagues in risk management, and sometimes when we read risk appetite statements, we just see that they are just defining it as an appetite for loss. And they say, well, on that aspect, I'm ready to lose that much. On this one, I'm ready to lose that much. We really believe that it should be also turned differently. The risk appetite should be also expressed in terms of exposure to risk by choice or constraint. So it's really important to consider that, but also in terms of required controls that you will need to put in place depending on your exposure and depending on the residual risk that you're expecting. So there are three different types of way of articulating your risk appetite statements, or your appetite for loss, your appetite for exposure, and your appetite for the type of control and internal control system that you will put in place in the organization. Why I said that it was, from my perspective, the cornerstone of risk management, because as we will see in a few slides, that defining this risk appetite and this tolerance will have a big impact on the way you articulate your risk matrix, your heat map. So it's extremely important. You will see that the way you will communicate this risk appetite, it will be reflected in your heat map. And I know that there are huge debates now within the risk community saying that, well, the risk map are not useful, probably. But if the risk map is well articulated, well designed, if the scales are calibrated, and if your risk appetite is reflected in your heat map, then you will see that it makes a lot of sense to use it. We will also see that defining the key risk indicator, it will be the ultimate stage when defining your risk appetite. We will start from qualitative statements, and we will transform this qualitative statement into thresholds that you will be able to monitor through key risk indicators. And of course, the loss events, so all the experience and the incidents that you are capturing within the organization will indicate whether the risk appetite is consistent with reality or not. Because what we experience also, it's companies that says, well, we have a strong reputation on the market. We will not accept any complaints from the customer. And in fact, what we discovered that they receive every day 10 complaints since 3 years. So there might be a mismatch between the risk appetite and the reality. And that's why it's really important to also investigate what has been done and what has been collected in terms of incidents to make sure that you perform this reality check. So to kind of summarize things that have been said just before, you can articulate the risk appetite in different ways. The first way is to describe what type of exposure that you are ready to take. If you say, for example, well, I don't want my company to be exposed to potential corruption cases. So in that case, don't start to a business in Russia, for example. I'm allowed to use that example as my wife is Russian, so it's kind of a check that I received that I can use. Another way to articulate the risk appetite statement and to describe it, it's to describe the controls that we'll put in place. Very often, we face situations where organizations are describing the risk appetite by expressing it with, I have no appetite for something. By describing this risk appetite with no appetite for something, we believe it does not allow you to define potential thresholds and to define then key risk indicators that will allow you to monitor your exposure to specific risk. So instead of describing a risk appetite statement with no appetite for something, we would like organizations to think about what are the controls that they will put in place to make sure that the risk will not materialize, instead of saying, well, we have no appetite for something. Of course, nobody has appetite for sexual harassment case or for unethical behavior from its staff. But instead of saying, well, I have no appetite for unethical behavior, turn it differently and describe, well, the organization will put in place this and this and this control to make sure that we will reduce this risk to its maximum. It's also showing that you are in the action, and just saying like, well, I have no appetite for that, that's all, period. I don't do anything. Well, I expect that it will not happen. That's what it means, in fact. So that's why we really push organizations to describe what are the key controls that they will put in place to make sure that the risk appetite will be translated into action, and that in the next step that we will see, the organization will be able to also monitor its exposure against that specific risk. And finally, the last one is the residual risk. So there you will express what you're ready to lose. So that's the most typical risk appetite that we find in different types of organization. Well, I'm ready to lose 50% of my investment on that part of the organization. Okay. All this will need, of course, to be challenged by the reality, and that's why you have to connect with this event and what has been already done in the organization to make sure that risk assessments are realistic. Okay, we see very often when we intervene in some organization that risk appetite statement is very inspirational, but are very often not realistic. So take care about that, and performing this reality check will allow you to identify where are the weaknesses in your risk appetite description. So a very simple framework to kind of organize your risk appetite and make sure that they will be actionable in the organization. So the risk appetite statement is something qualitative. I know that it's very difficult for some organizations that have a more quantitative background, like in the financial sector, but the risk appetite statement should be qualitative. It will express the posture that have an organization against a specific risk category. So it needs to be defined per risk category. The second pillar are really the key controls. So what are the governance and the internal control that are in place, aspects that are in place in the organization, and that are supposed to address the risk that you would like to describe in the risk appetite statement. Why we are pushing for that? Because sometimes it might be easier and it will be much more actionable to describe the risk appetite statements by describing the control environment that will be put in place to make sure that this risk will be addressed. Having all this, it will allow you then to build your key risk indicator and the threshold, because it's extremely important to allow this monitoring, to inform you that you are increasing your exposure on specific types of risk, or that it might also inform you that your risk appetite statement is not well defined. Let's take an example. What if an incident happened or a risk materialized and your risk indicator did not really inform you about that? Maybe you have to revise your risk appetite or revise the way your key risk indicator has been defined. Okay, and on the opposite, what if your key risk indicator is always in the red and in reality nothing happens? Again, it will need also to be challenged on risk appetite statements and the way you are developing or aggregating the information to build this key risk indicator. Good. Here it's really just high-level example, and it's really a great topic, because by defining the risk appetite statements, it's allow you to show the posture that have an organization, and it's really linked also to the values of the organization. I know that now people are pushing a lot to have everything quantified, but I work with a lot of international organizations and international public organizations that are really very much driven by values, for example. And for them, it's extremely important to show their posture against specific values. They really like to have the risk appetite aligned with the values that they have adopted. Just take some examples showing that the risk appetite can be articulated in such a way that you will include the norms that a firm should follow, in that case, to reduce the reputational risk. Here, it's really about the reputation of some international public organization. If I take the fourth bullet point, commit to the training of technical competence of all staff and strong supervisory skills. There, it's the type of risk appetite statement that you will need to further develop to address specific risk items. So, and it will be translated in such a way that you will monitor that risk by with a key risk indicator about the percentage of people having followed this training and the percentage of people having been identified with strong supervisory skills, for example. And you will expect to reach a certain level to make sure that this specific risk will be addressed. This slide, I think it's well, it will be the most important, I think, because this, as we have seen, these overarching statements will be then defined into qualitative statements per risk area, depending on your risk taxonomy, of course. And then these qualitative statements will be, as we have seen, will be turned into thresholds by defining these quantitative thresholds. And from these thresholds, you will be able to define your key risk indicators. Okay. And what we see in many organizations is that things are completely disconnected. We go in organization when they say, well, this is our risk map, our heat map, these are our scales, and now we will define our risk appetite. Say, well, it's something that needs to be at least done jointly, or you have to start from your risk appetite statements, because the risk appetite statements, basically it will define the colors in your heat map, showing where it's above or below appetite and where it's acceptable or not acceptable. So it's extremely important. And what we see also very often is that some people are missing that step. And on top of that, they are not considering or not performing the calibration of scales from the heat map. This calibration can be only performed once the risk appetite statements are clearly defined. If you say, well, in terms of operation, this is the disruption that I can accept with a certain limit. And from a financial perspective, this is my financial threshold. This is what I can also accept. Both will need to be aligned in the scales. And what we see very often is that this calibration has not been performed, meaning that in many organizations, I would say in many organizations, we see that risk appetite for this category is yellow, for this one it's amber, for this one it's red, while it could be done in a much more simple way by first defining the risk appetite statements, then calibrating the scales, and then building your heat map. We see that very often everything is disconnected, meaning, and I made that mistake when I was chief risk officer of an organization, and it then becomes very complicated to explain to the business, well, this risk, no, that's fine, it's amber, but that's fine, because it's just an operational risk. Well, this one, yes, I know it's also amber, but it's not fine because it's legal. And then people are getting completely confused. So we really believe that defining clear risk appetite statements, defining their thresholds, and using that to calibrate your scale will ease the work in the implementation of a strong approach in the organization. So basically, what you can have is the risk to choose and to avoid. The risk to choose are the risks that you are ready to pay for. Okay, when you are expecting a positive return, you have also the risk to avoid, and there you will describe, in fact, instead of saying we have no appetite for something, please describe what are the controls that you are ready to put in place. And the risk to balance, for example, you might say, well, I have an appetite in reducing my resource in that type of project to reinforce other types of projects, or what we see in international organization. Sometimes they might deviate from the budget if they are expecting to have a higher impact on communities, for example. These are just some examples on how to structure the brainstorming if you'd like to address the topic in your organization for the definition of risk appetites. You have to start with simple questions like what is tolerable in the short term, in the long run, having some example of really what is disturbing and what is really not acceptable, to kind of fine tune how you will define your risk appetite statements, and then you move to what is completely unacceptable. And by collecting all this information, all this qualitative information, and by structuring it, you will then be able to draft clear risk appetite statements that will make sense in the organization and that can be used to define then the thresholds and help you and support you in the definition of the scales. Sorry, I was a little bit fast, but I wanted to make sure that I will respect the time allocated for the presentation so that we can then have a discussion with all the questions.
Yes, well done, David, on the timing. Thanks for that. While we will wait for people to type their questions in the chat, maybe I have the time to ask you one. So let's say we have maximum 8-9 minutes for questions for now, and we'll see if we have more in the end. So I'd like to ask you one question before we see some others in the chat. So maybe how do you make sure that the way you express the risk appetite follows the reality of the organization and the development of that organization?
Okay, so the first step really is to involve the people who know. Defining the risk appetite statements, it's really interesting, but you need to involve the subject matter experts that have the knowledge to discuss about specific risk appetite statements. And what we do, it's really performing reality checks. That's essential in the way you are defining your risk appetite statements. We have plenty of organizations where they say, oh, you know, we don't want to see our people leaving the organization. The turnover is really something that retaining key people is essential for us, and blah, 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 blah. We have no appetite for that. We keep the best. And then we see that the turnover is it's more than 10%. I'm talking here about the Belgian market. 10% of turnover is extremely high. And we see that a lot of key people are leaving. So there we say, well, are you sure about what you are stating? Or maybe we should rephrase it or turn it more in terms of what you are doing to make sure that people are not leaving, or that your key people are not leaving the organization. Oh yes, we have these incentive plans. We identify them on yearly basis. We allow them to have a specific track. Okay, so write that in your risk appetite statement, saying that key people will be identified and we expect them to go through a specific track, and we will blah, 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 blah. And then it will be transformed into a quantitative indicator saying, well, 90% of the people identified will need to follow that, and that training. And you will know that if you don't fit to that threshold, you might be at risk. But good question. It is essential to really perform this reality check to make sure that risk appetite statements are a little bit inspirational because it shows the posture of the organization, but it should not be only inspirational. It should be realistic.
So maybe in that same vein, we'll see, we'll wait for the questions on the chat still. I have another one more, I mean, linked more the human aspect. How do you make sure people understand the difference between a risk they are not ready to take, they're not ready to accept themselves, and a risk the company cannot accept?
Do you have an example in mind?
You have people taking risks from their personal point of view, and they don't realize the company cannot bear that risk at all. So the human aspect, the personal side versus the company side.
Yeah, so everything is about the communication of the risk appetite statements and make sure that everybody understands it very well. So what we should avoid when drafting, and I know it's extremely difficult to do that. Sometimes it's very difficult for us also to do that. We should avoid like fluffy wording when defining the risk appetite statements, saying, well, we have a low appetite for something, and then you don't elaborate. Or we would like to keep this a minor exposure to something. Low and minor means everything and nothing at the same time. Everybody has a different interpretation of these words. That's why we are really pushing people to turn them into risk appetite statement that can be translated into action. And instead of using these type of statements, saying what the company is doing to make sure that you stay within appetite, and then people will understand, okay, this is what we should do, and that's what we are doing to stay in control and make sure that we are not too much exposed. You know, so the way you are communicating and phrasing and the risk appetite statement is extremely important, by not using too generic words and making sure that it's really specific to the organization.
Yeah, thanks, David.
What we should avoid, I will talk about personal experience. What we should avoid, really, it's some. I worked in different organizations, and I've asked some people to help me drafting the risk appetite statement. And in fact, the third time I thought, well, I have the feeling that these are exactly the same statement than in the two previous organizations. So we have to avoid to be too generic when writing risk appetite statement. It should be really specific, it should fit the company culture, and it should speak to the people. And a good way to do that is to avoid generic terms and make sure that this risk appetite will be actionable.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, David. Maybe to Pascal with the chat.
We have a couple of great questions. Actually, it's a lot. And the first one, probably it kind of hooks into what you just said. So the question is, what is the best way to sell the idea of risk appetite to leadership when they believe the plans, like the business plans and strategic objectives, are adequate already?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, especially that the risk appetite statements that you are defining needs to be approved at the highest level of the organization. You know, so it's a very good way. In fact, a very good practice is to be involved when a new strategy is defined. And for each strategic items, you ask the question, how far can we go on that aspect, and what will not be acceptable. So being part of that discussion will really help you to frame risk appetite statements that will be really tangible for the senior management.
Thank you. There's actually a lot. I think we can't capture all of them, but I just picked a few there. Can you please explain more about calibration and the steps how to get there?
Oh God, I can make a whole session about that. And in fact, it's very simple. Well, very simple. I will simplify very much, but don't take it. It should not be as simplistic as it is. I've worked in an organization where I had to design a risk heat map, and in fact, I reuse like standardized or basic scales. And in fact, you have to clearly think about it. And the risk calibration is, well, if an event happens and having a financial impact level 3, let's say €1 million, and if the same event happen and have an operational impact level 3, like 2 hours disruption in our key operation, does it mean the same? Does it mean the same for the organization? And then you will see what will be the reaction of the people. Oh, no. Losing 1 million, it's embarrassing, but that's fine. But being out of the business during 2 hours, that's totally not acceptable. And then you will see that your scales are not real calibrated, because the impact 3 should mean the same in all cases. And in fact, what the tendency that we have is we start designing the scales from left to right, and we say, well, level 1, that's the description of level 1. Level 2, I will increase a bit. Level 3, I will put more. And level 4, level 5. And then you do it again for another types of impact. And you will start from the left, you will increase a bit, then increase a bit, then increase a bit. And what we usually don't check is the consistency across the levels. So not reading from left to right, but from the top to the down, top down, you know, from up to down. And level 3 financial impact, does it mean really the same than level 3 operational impact? Does it mean exactly the 3 for reputational impact? And then it's like you are crossing the information to make sure that it will make sense. And to make sure that it makes sense and that scales are calibrated, you will need to refer to the risk appetite statement. And then you will see, well, we have maybe a higher tolerance on financial loss, while operational disruption, we have a very low appetite. So for an organization, being 2 hours out of business can be much more embarrassing than losing 1 million. And it will be reflected in the risk appetite statements. That's how everything is connected. So that's the calibration exercise that needs to happen.
Maybe two more. One goes into the quantification part, and that is, which criteria do you suggest to include in the quantitative risk appetite statement?
Which criteria? Can you be more precise on this one?
Maybe we pull it back and do it at the end of the presentation. Maybe we get a clearer statement. Meanwhile, maybe one more, and then we can move to Rose. So under the aspect that every employee is a risk manager, in your experience, how does the communication and application of risk appetite throughout the organization work best?
So so that's very personal, but I don't like this idea of every employee is a risk manager. We had a discussion recently with the Chief Operational Risk Officer of the World Bank, Amédée Provost, and we discussed about that. And in fact, we believe it's much better to say everybody has a role in risk management. Not everybody is a risk manager. Everybody has a role to play in risk management, and the role might be completely different. And what needs to be really well understood by the people in the organization, by saying, well, you know, everybody is a risk manager. I did that when I was working in a big pharmaceutical company, and before I was always saying that, in the end, people really believed that they were a real risk manager. So they they said, yeah, you know, risk management, I do it every day. Say, okay, but can I help you? No. I take that into account for every decision. And then you see how maybe I passed the wrong message. It's much better to say, well, everybody has a role in risk management, and then you will have to qualify what is the role of different types of specific employees in the organization. I think it's much better to gain in terms of awareness, culture, and again, it's to make sure that it will be really tangible for people. If you say, well, everybody is a risk manager, in the end, they might be a little bit lost. Okay, but what does that mean? What's behind that? No, you are expecting that operational teams that are reporting well the incidents they're facing and that they're applying the controls. You are expecting those that are setting goals and the strategy, that are taking into account different types of scenario, and that they are assessing the strategy against different types of risk exposure. And you see, so everybody, I would not say so everybody is a risk manager, but more everybody has a role in risk management.
Thank you very much, David. I think we have to go now to Rose. So I'll present briefly Rose, and if we have time, we'll continue with the questions at the end of the webinar. So Rose is the Corporate Enterprise Risk Manager at Swiss Steel Group. She became part of the committee of IRM Switzerland this year in April. She has an extensive expertise in enterprise and operational risk management, internal control systems, and integrated assurance areas in the manufacturing, financial industry, and digitalization. Rose also has an MBA, executive MBA in technology from the University of Freiburg in Switzerland, and she holds a degree in mechanical engineering from the Universidade Gama Filho in Brazil. I don't know if my presentation is good or not. Rose, it's going to be a very, very different trip with you from what David just went through. We'll see if we have to choose from one another or combine both, but let's see what you can propose around risk-bearing capacity. Thanks, Rose.
Thank you, Stefan. Hope that you can hear me. If someone gives a sign, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dave. Really wonderful what I've heard about values at risk and so on. And what I'm trying to do today was to show a case study that I've been working. And in this case study, then I use different sources. In the presentation, you can see all the sources that I have used. I think it's very useful that you, if you would like to adapt this to your organization, that you have the source, because there are a lot of more information in these sources. I will start with it, and hope you can see it. It's okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I started, I'm Brazilian, huh? And Stefan, your Portuguese is wonderful. Universidade Gama Filho, yes. I'm Brazilian, I'm here in Switzerland a long time. And then that's why I allowed myself to give this title. It's all about Swiss cheese. It's wonderful. You can you can believe. And why I choose this title, just because I've started with this. I'm not talking about all these points in our today's presentation. This is just sharing my experience. And also to give you the end-to-end, how we approach, or how I've approached that. But we started with our ambition. This is, I want this cheese, and it's Swiss cheese. It's even better. And then we started to sounding our environment, external, internal, and what are our capabilities to cope with these risks, the risk that we want to. David has also explained that it's important to classify what are the risks that we would like to take to set up or to implement our strategy. And the last part is adjust or plug in the possible gap that we find that make us fit to cope with it. Then, as I said, I won't go through all the three, but I think it's important that you have the end-to-end view. If we start with the ambitions, the idea here is to define our strategic direction and planning process, and target set and budget process. This is also cascaded from the strategy. Here, the idea was where we are, where we want to go. It's also part of the presentation that Kurt Meyer has also presented in IRM last year, no, 2040. And this presentation is it's also available in our internal, our regional group. Then after we decided that, we started with the budget process. That we see what are the things that we need to achieve in every year. After doing that, the idea is now to get where we want to go. What are the risks that I may face, or what are the risks that I want to face, and what are the risks that I already have in my portfolio? And here I started with the risk inverse. What are the risks that we are currently facing and that we are seeing for the future? Here I gave some three possibilities. There are some companies that are used to work with a more qualitative way. Then I would recommend the Monte Carlo simulation. If it's not the quantitative approach, it's not the most important thing, because you are working with more qualitative approach. Then I would suggest, this is also a recommendation from Dr. Peter Hager, and it's in RiskNet. Here, the idea is that in this way we could choose different scenarios. The possible scenario would be every risk that it's bigger than 50% probability, and so on. With the Monte Carlo simulation, I gave 2 examples. One is also provided by Institute of Risk Management. There is a wonderful document with risk appetite and tolerance guidance paper. And the third one, it's also internet available. It's from Dr. Professor Werner Geisner. And here he puts the impact of each risk in our P&L, and after that runs the risk appetite in the tool for Monte Carlo simulation. I have this book. This is a very it's also a very helpful book if you want to do a test that you can use with the crystal ball Monte Carlo simulation. But what's important to see what the risk universe, that there is not only one possibility. There are different possibilities that you can aggregate your risk to find out what are the risk portfolio that you have in your hand, and whether this is then you still have some reserve to implement your new strategy or to implement the steps by steps that you have planned. You have here the best case and the worst case, and this is then what's the deviation from my business plan. After that, I'm going to, okay, I have my strategy, I have my goals, I have observed what are the amount of risks that I'm already facing or that I have identified that I may face with this new strategy. And now I will define then what is the capability. And here it's very important also as what Dave has said, that in this we need to look at the maturity of the risk management within the organization, because if we place this together with the values of the organization, it's a very good starting point that you have, that you can implement, use this in the daily business. If there is a gap between what is your risks statements or risk appetite, risk tolerance, or bearing capacity, or if you have another definition that is not a must, if you do not have this a reality check, as David has said, this will be difficult to implement this, because it will be a paper and we are not going to use this in the daily decision making. Here, that's why I said that it's important to look at the maturity. If the company is not mature enough to implement this yet, it's something that it's a learning curve. I would say that the start point with value, it's a very good advice that you will get this work in your organization if we have this starting point. To calculate the bearing capacity, I'm not going to the definition of each one of that. I can share what I have with you after, if you have further questions or other questions. I've started with the bearing capacity. That's the very the baseline. And there it's to see how much reserve do I have to cope with the risks that I have in my portfolio. Then there is two parts that I need to calculate. One is the substance, what I have, and this in hand, and the second one is what I'm planning to achieve, and what I'm planning to achieve I can use this also to cope with the risks that may come. And here the important thing is that you are not using what you expected, but you are using some external reference, like an analyst consensus for the industry, or analyst consensus for your company. If you are rated, you can also get this from your rating agents. That it's something that's it's more reliable than your own statement or your own judgment. Here you have the step-by-step how to get. You can get all those values if you are listed and you have the report. All those values you can get from your balance sheet report and P&L. That's not something that it's written. No, it's in our statements. If we come now for the next, as also Dave has said, that's every risk appetite or every risk statement needs to turn something into action. We need to use this for the next step. And here is then I will then compare what is my risk exposure with what I'm capable to deal with. After the risk aggregation, I put also you can do the risk aggregation with Monte Carlo, or if you use the simplified, more conservative approach, you could get all this the possible scenario. And with that, you have then your amount of aggregated risks. With this amount of aggregated risk, you have also possibility to have the different scenarios that are that may occur with the baseline or with the worst case and the best case. That it's then what everybody is looking for. Here you have the bearing capacity. Normally, as I mentioned it before, is the substance and the performance, what I'm getting, what I'm planning to get. Everything else, it's not something that are available to use to cope with risks that I would like to take to grow. This wouldn't be a good advice. And this is then something that if you have an asset, like I'm working with a very with metal industry where we have a big asset portfolio, is something that you need to have as your reserve. After you compare then what are your total risk, aggregated risks, with the risk bearing capacity that you have, you may come to a gap. Here in this example that I'm putting here, my risk bearing capacity, and I've put this intentionally, it's much lower than the risks that I'm facing. That means it's really a bad situation in this example, because I'm trying to define something to grow, or what are my next planet achievements. But with the risks that I already have on hand, I already have a very risky profile. That means I'm not able to take any additional risks. And this is also something in this example that brings us to reality. Doesn't matter if I'm trying to pursue a goal that is something that I'm putting the whole corporation at risk. That means in this point, I'm translating the model or the framework that I'm presenting into actions. now I could have also a very different scenario than this example that I put here, but now I need to take actions to close this gap that's in this example I'm presenting. Then I'm coming to the next point, and that means I need to adjust. And in this part, there are different possibilities. If this is something that it's a risk that I want to take, if my scenario, if my previous steps has showed that I have a very ambitious, I have set a very ambitious target that doesn't fit in my current situation, because my organization it's facing a lot of risks right now. I need then to move this target down and bring it in the real world. Or in the other way around, it can be that I get to a conclusion that reserve and I'm not using this to grow. That means I need to be more ambitious, and I need to set my goals even higher than what I've initially planned. Then it's here we are translating into actions. Or it can be that it's perfectly met what I have planned with my risk portfolio. That means here I'm using it, and it's very interesting. I saw that the question is how we can get the buy-in, or this is something that we can present. I would say if I'm presented to the CFO, or I use the quantitative way, it's very valuable. And I would say I'm using this kind of approach. If I'm presenting this to the board, this is also a kind of approach that I can use, that I can show the values, and I'm not put the risks in each position from my P&L, but I'm put the risk in the things that are important for my shareholders. That means we need also to see to whom we are presenting this, and to whom we are talk about, or we are getting the approval, because the board needs to approve it, and this is the latest stage is the board. Then it's very important to adjust your language to the to your audience, or to who has asked, or to whom you want to present your idea.
Rose, we have something like a few minutes left. So
okay,
if you
I'm finished.
So you can have a chance to answer some questions.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. The last part is, it can be that I see that I have a problem. My goals are very ambitious, and I'm facing a lot of risks. What I need to do then, instead of change my strategic direction, is to get fundings that I can then be ready to risk more, and also to have some positive effects, or then not just the downside risk. With that, I've presented it. What I've done at the end, ambition, sounding, and action, is the summary, what we have done, what we have seen here. And of course, I'm also very happy to answer any questions that you would like also to address after the presentation. Thank you very much. And now you have your cheese, your Swiss cheese, that we can enjoy the afternoon, or I don't know where you are, sitting all over the world, but here would be a nice thing to do in a Thursday night.
When COVID is over, probably.
Exactly.
We do have
a
few questions on the question box. Do you want to shoot, Pascal? We have some questions from our friends, Daniel, Kurt, for example, as well.
So, Rose, would
Yes.
you suggest a similar approach to demonstrate? Sorry, I just lost another question. Would you suggest a similar approach to demonstrate we are not talking enough risk? For example, when we are far below risk-bearing capacity.
Yes. For example, if I have a lot of cash, there are some industries that, in fact, you have you need to see, is there an additional market? Is there an additional for new products, or to expand my product, or to increase organically or inorganically? And if I have with my balance sheet and my P&L, I see that my ambitions is not that enough ambitions, because then I will, if there is no risk, there is also no chance to get something more. That's why it's all about we want the cheese, and then let's take it, and for that I need to take some risks. And if the company has a lot of financial reserve and it's very conservative and take risks, in a long term, this is not the best approach. That means I need to be more ambitious.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I...
I think it's good. Another question, first of all, thank you for the practical example. How would you suggest should risk management be placed in an organization, or to be empowered, in order to turn risk analysis into action?
I think the organization is something that supports tone on the top, of course. One thing that David has also pointed out, if we link with our values, and if you translate or give this a very realistic approach, where you are defining your risk appetite, or what you are ready to put at risk, it's something that's that it will become more and more used while taking decisions. But if you put something that it's not realistic, that it's not this realistic check that David has pointed out, it's important, because if you are put something just to be in a paper, this won't get, or the risk management won't be something that will be translated into actions. And also from top management is something that they want to see things that we can use in a daily basis.
Okay. One last question, and first of all, thank you all very much for sending all these questions. I think it's great feedback. We will collect these questions. Those that are not answered, we will pass on to the speakers so that we can send them via email then. So the last question is, first of all, can you please repeat the book you just showed? And the question that comes with it is, would you suggest to use it for all kinds of risks, like the bearing approach, or is it more suitable for some than others?
This is to quantify a risk with crystal ball. I wouldn't use this, for example, for health and safety. Health and safety is something that needs to be in a qualitative way, and this is more used to see what are the scenarios that you can simulated, and what are the interconnectedness between risks. What's the root of cause? What are the if one risk take place, what are the probability that the next risks will follow in a cascade, in a domino effect, and so on. And but this is more for quantitative. But there is no one fits all. I have some risks that I'm just doing this in a qualitative way that make more sense, and I have some risks that I'm doing in a quantitative way. If I need to talk with banks to get some fundings, or if I need to talk with some creditors, and then I need to use a quantitative way. But the qualitative, it's something that needs to be also in mind, because I need to have something that is adequate. This book, I have a good reference, and it's a very with a lot of examples also that you can use and implement.
Okay. I would suggest we also send it then via email, because
yes.
we ran out of time. I take the opportunity to thank you, Rose and David, for showing us your approach, and also a big thank you to the audience, to everyone who joined today. Please also check out all the other sessions. There are very interesting sessions coming up from the SIGs and the RIGs. So I hope to see you there. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.